Good evening, everyone. I'm Jessica Nickel, the Director and Chief Curator of the Smith College Museum of Art, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this afternoon's lecture by Dr. Massumeh Farhad, the Chief Curator and Curator of Islamic Art at the Smithsonian Freer and Sackler Galleries. Today's program is offered in conjunction with our current exhibition, Collecting Art of Asia, which commemorates the 100th anniversary of the Smith College Museum of Art's first acquisitions of Asian art in 1913. They came as gifts to Smith from Charles Lang Freer, who was the founder of the Freer Gallery. This is a spring of anniversaries for us. The Brown Fine Arts Center, which houses our museum, opened to the public 10 years ago, almost to this day. The creation of the Brown Fine Arts Center renewed and expanded the museum's spaces for the display and study of art. That, in turn, led to a renewed and expanded vision for the museum's collection and the ways it supports learning at Smith. One of the key elements of that vision is a commitment to expanding beyond the museum's historical focus on European and American art in order to support the global breadth of Smith's curriculum. You've seen that enacted over the past decade as the museum has presented exhibitions of African, Asian, and Islamic art. We've experienced the greatest momentum and response to our efforts to develop our collection and program in Asian art. That's due in part to the strength of Asian studies here at Smith and the active use and interest that our exhibitions of Asian art have elicited from faculty and from students. Our success in building our program in Asian art is also the result of having the guidance and support of a particularly knowledgeable and committed group of alumni advisors, many of whom are here with us tonight, and I'd like to welcome them and thank them publicly for their leadership and their dedication. I'd also like to recognize and thank President Carol Christ. This decade-long project at the museum has paralleled her 11-year tenure as president of Smith College. Like her predecessors, she has nurtured the Smith College Museum of Art as a uniquely valuable learning resource, and she's been particularly supportive of our efforts to develop the museum's collections and programs in ways that are responsive to the college's mission and priorities. I'm very grateful for her leadership and advocacy. While we've been working to build our collection of Asian art, we've also been working to study and conserve its historical foundation, which began developing 100 years ago. Collecting Art of Asia represents the culmination of those efforts to understand how our collection has grown, and it marks a turning point as we commit to its continued development in the next century. This project would not have been possible without the skill, knowledge, and insight of Dr. Fan Zhang, who for the past 3 years has held the Freeman McPherson Curatorial and Teaching Postdoctoral Fellowship in East Asian Art, a mouthful. Fan has led the efforts to study our holdings and to articulate the plan for their future development. His research into Charles Lang Freer's early association with Smith College was the inspiration for the current centennial exhibition and for tonight's lecture. Collecting Art of Asia has been made possible by the generous support of the Louisa Studi Seraphim 1995 Charitable Trust and the Brown Foundation Incorporated of Houston, Texas, both through the initiative of Louisa Studi Seraphim. Support for this evening's lecture has been provided by the Carlin Steiner Class of 1967 and George Steiner Endowed Fund, given in honor of Joan Koch Smith. We thank these alumni donors for their extraordinary support of our efforts and for enabling us to share our collection of Asian art and its history with our campus and our larger community. Now I'd like to invite Dr. Fan Zhang to the podium to introduce our speaker.
Good evening. I'm Fan Zhang, one of the curators of the current exhibition, Collecting Art of Asia, which celebrates the 100 years of exhibiting and collecting art of Asia at Smith College Museum of Art. Here I would like to thank Jessica Nickel, the museum director, for her leadership. I believe without her leadership and also the support of my colleagues, my research idea would not be developed into this current exhibition. Smith College has a pioneering role in displaying Asian art in the early 20th century. Thanks to the efforts of Smith art professor Dwight Tryon and his major patron, Charles Lang Freer. These two friends sought the echoes between Eastern and Western art and promoted the appreciation for Asian art in liberal arts education at that time. Freer later donated more than 9,000 works of his Asian and American art and a large fund to the nation. The Freer Gallery of Art opened to the public in 1923 and becomes the National Museum of Asian Art, part of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. Inspired by Freer, Dwight Tryon also donated his art collection to the Smith College, along with a large fund to build a new art gallery here in 1925. Smith College received its first gifts of Asian art from Freer in 1913, comprising 12 carved wooden and lacquer panels of various subjects. Based on his gifts, the museum assembled other pieces and developed the first gallery installation of Asian art in 1914. Through Freer's introduction, Lawrence Bingham, keeper of Asian prints and drawings at the British Museum, was invited to the campus to give 6 consecutive lectures on Asian art. Later that year, the very first Asian art lectures at Smith. Interestingly, Freer loved to invite scholars to give lectures and often persuaded museums to organize educational programs linked to Asian art exhibitions based on his loans. Today, we still carry this tradition and mission in art education and has organized scholarly lectures accompany previous Asian exhibitions, including those given by Professor Sonia Ray from University of Southern California in 2011 and by Professor Yukio Lipit from Harvard University in 2012. Today, I'm glad that we are able to invite Dr. Massumeh Farhad, the caretaker of the significant Freer collection in Washington, D.C. Dr. Farhad joined the Freer Gallery of Art and other M. Sackler Gallery in 1995 as the Associate Curator of Islamic Art. In 2004, she was appointed Chief Curator and Curator of Islamic Art. A specialist in the arts of the book from 16th to 17th century Iran, Dr. Farhad has a wide range of interests and has curated numerous exhibitions on the arts of the Islamic world at the Freer and Sackler, including Art of the Persian Courts in 1996, Fountains of Light, the Nuhat S. Said collection of metalwork in 2000, Style and Status, Imperial Costumes from Ottoman Turkey in 2005, Zarth and East, Gifts from Turkey and Iran in the Moscow Kremlin in 2009, and the Rose of Arabia, History and Archaeology of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in 2012. Dr. Farhad received her bachelor's degree from Wellesley College and her PhD degree in Islamic art history from Harvard University in 1987. She has served as president of the Historians of Islamic Art and is an institutional trustee for the American Institute for Iranian Studies. She has written extensively on 17th century Persian painting, including Slaves of Tsar, New Elites in Safavid Iran in 2004, and Fanama, the Book of Omens in 2009. With the rich archival and art collection resources at the Freer and Sackler, she has studied the history of Asian art collecting in the US and will give us this lecture based on her recent work, which is entitled In Search of Harmony, Early Collectors of Asian Art in America. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Farhad to give this lecture. Thanks.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. thank you for coming this evening. It's beautiful outside, so a special thank you for being inside in a dark auditorium. I wanted to thank the Smith College Museum of Art for inviting me. This is a wonderful privilege to be here and seeing the galleries and the collection. I really want to congratulate all of you for putting that together. I sort of snuck in this afternoon and had a look, and it really is a tribute to everyone who has worked on it, and hopefully you can continue to build. So the timing is perfect for me. I also want to congratulate Dr. Zhang for a wonderful catalog. I sort of wasn't quite sure after reading the catalog why you wanted me here, because he sort of seems to have laid it all out, but I will do my best. And finally, I should also thank you exactly for that, because thanks to this invitation, I learned about an aspect of the Freer collection that I have to admit I really did not know that much about. Of course, I knew about Tryon and about his paintings in the Freer, but I had I knew very little about the relationship, the other relationship of Freer and Tryon and Smith College. So I have to thank you for that as well. But before we sort of get to Freer and Tryon, I thought I'll take you on a little tour and look at other collectors, early collectors of Asian art in America, to give you a context of what was going on in the late 19th and early 20th century, and why Asian art became so important to so many leading collectors. I think it was 1884, Mrs. Havemeyer recalls in her memoirs, when my husband said to me one morning, "A case of tea jars will arrive today. You'd better unpack them and make a selection. Take out what you want and put the rest in the storeroom." "But what is a tea jar?" I asked innocently. Mr. Havemeyer looked at me curiously, as if amused that my question could puzzle him. And then he said frankly, "Well, I don't know much about them myself. They are little brown jars that hold tea. I guess that covers it. But they are beautiful, so soft you want to hold them in your hand, and so lovely in color you cannot but admire them. Just sober, dark brown." And on the screen, you see one of the Havemeyer tea jars, which is now at the Metropolitan Museum. Like many Americans, Henry Osborne Havemeyer, who made his fortune in sugar refineries, was introduced to Asian art in 1876 at the Philadelphia Centennial Exhibition. At this time, the fascination with Asia, in particular Japan, had already gripped Europe and had washed ashore to the United States. In 1853, Japan reopened its ports for trade with the West, and Japanese goods flooded Europe. Coupled with the spread of colonialism and in the Industrial Revolution, Asia and things Asian became available throughout Europe. Artists such as Van Gogh, Monet, and Whistler were among many of those who incorporated kimonos, fans, and other exotic objects into their work. But they also began to experiment with strong flat colors in lieu of one-point perspective and with asymmetrical compositions, which were formal concepts already in use in Chinese and Japanese art. In 1867, Paris hosted the legendary Exposition Universelle. It included, for the first time, a Japanese and a Chinese section, which introduced Asia to a wider French and European audience. 10 years later, in 1876, Philadelphia decided to hold a World's Fair to commemorate the centennial of the Declaration of Independence. According to Harper's Magazine, and I quote, "Philadelphia appears for once to have thrown off her somber Quaker apparel and to have ushered in the centennial with much air of a venerable old lady, endearing to execute some difficult steps in the can-can." Although the fortunes of the Gilded Age were already in the making, the 1870s was a period of political and economic uncertainty, and the fair was a welcoming relief. The organizers aimed to challenge any sense of doubt and restore confidence in the American system of government and its social and economic vitality. What is interesting is that the idea of the Centennial Fair was actually one that was first proposed at the Smithsonian by John Campbell, a professor at Wabash College. In the course of the planning, the role of the sciences, especially those showcased at the Smithsonian, also expanded considerably, and the Smithsonian got a sizable footprint at the fair. Both China and Japan were invited to participate, and their presence stirred considerable public attention. James McCabe of the Illustrated History of the Centennial Exhibition describes the Japanese section as follows, and I'm quoting, "It was filled in every art with a rich and valuable display, the variety and beauty of which are one of the great surprises of the exhibition." McCabe further observes, "The display of porcelain in this single department surpasses in beauty and forms and ornamentation the combined exhibit of every other nation." There were also examples of Japanese silks, lacquers, screens, and furniture, which received unanimous praise. The Illustrated History concludes, "The visitor who makes even a hasty inspection of the display must amend his view of Japan. We have been accustomed to regard that country as uncivilized, or half uncivilized at best. But we find here abundant evidence that it outshines the most cultivated nations of Europe in arts, which is their pride and glory." Now, what is interesting is that Japan was actually emerging as a global economic and political powerhouse during the Meiji period, at the time when the centennial was taking place. Even so, America would increasingly characterize Japanese art and design as the products of a pre-modern world of beauty and imagination, thus enhancing the aesthetic appeal of Japanese art to serious collectors and mass consumers alike. The Chinese section was smaller than the Japanese one, and described in less favorable terms. Despite the great profits that Philadelphia financiers had reaped from trade with China, the country and its people were mistrusted. According to the public record, and I quote, "The old empire of China has received little from Western civilization and advancement, and as a consequence makes a display at the exposition which is curious. Reportedly, the entrance to the pavilion, and I quote, gaudily painted and ornamented with hideous curled-up dragons, which though ugly, were well carved." Nothing like a backhanded compliment. The public record remarks, however, and I quote, "The display gathered within the enclosure is rich, valuable, and exceedingly interesting. And some of it is so fine as anything that can be found in the Japanese section, which is saying a great deal." Reportedly, the overall effect was one of a large Chinese bazaar and considered somewhat too jarring for the American audience. Julia Meach has determined that Havemeyer attended the fair with the American painter and interior designer Samuel Coleman, and both men became fascinated with Chinese and Japanese displays. 14 years later, Coleman and his collaborator, Louise Comfort Tiffany, decorated the Havemeyer Mansion with Chinese, Japanese, Islamic, and Byzantine objects, most of which were acquired at the various fairs. While Coleman covered the walls and ceilings of the foyer and the music room with Japanese silk, Tiffany embedded the floor with over 1 million little tiles of sort of glass mosaics that were apparently inspired by Islamic Spain. Describing the silk-covered ceiling, Mrs. Havemeyer remarks, and I quote, "It glows like a rich mosaic of the East, like the St. Sophia and the splendid tombs of Constantinople." Subsequent fairs in Europe and the United States, as well as the growing number of dealers, such as Yamanaka and Company, an international company based in Osaka with branches in London, New York, and Chicago, continued to promote Japanese art in the United States. Another avid collector was the railroad magnate William T. Walters of Baltimore, who acquired, according to Meach, some 4,000 objects, mainly from the Meiji period, and these formed the basis of the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore today. An example of the Asian art craze run amok, according to Julia Meach, was the Vanderbilt Mansion on Fifth Avenue, which was designed between 1879 and 1882. Much like the installation at the international fairs, here objects in all media were amassed, creating a dizzying effect of conspicuous consumption. For other American collectors, it was travel to Asia that allowed for the first-hand experience of the arts and cultures of new and foreign lands. Instead of trips to Paris, London, and Vienna, it was Kyoto, Shanghai, Delhi, Agra, and Alexandria that became the desired destinations. One such figure was Isabella Stewart Gardner. Born in 1840 in New York, Isabella Stewart married John Lowell Gardner Jr. at the age of 20 and became a flamboyant fixture of Boston society and the eventual founder of the celebrated Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston. Like many other men and women of her social standing, Mrs. Gardner became fascinated with Asian art and hosted a number of lectures by Edward Sylvester Morse. A zoologist by training, Morse spent 3 years in Japan in the late 1870s and the early 1880s teaching Darwinian evolutionary theory. His interest turned to ceramics, and he amassed a very impressive collection, which he eventually donated to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. He also served as the first curator or keeper of Asian art at the MFA. Mrs. Gardner had already visited Egypt in 1874, and at the urging of Morse, she and her husband embarked on a tour of Asia in 1883. They visited India, Cambodia, China, and the Near East. And her trip had a profound effect on both her interest in Asia and her subsequent collecting. Her personal views and impressions, both in word and image, are captured in a series of wonderful diaries with photographs, sketches that have recently been made available. For instance, and I just want to give you 2 quotes of her diaries. While sailing on a boat up the Nile, she remarks, "I went up, as usual, alone after dinner, and found the steersman at prayers, his forehead touching the deck. As I lay upon the couch, with a fragrance of frankincense stealing over me, the wake of the moon was a fit path by which my thoughts went straight to Cleopatra. And I forgot it was Christmas Eve." Writing to a friend in 1884 from Japan, she maintains, "Please don't be shocked, dear, at all the proceedings," referring to her frequent visits to sumo matches. "I shall go and see the missionaries when I go back to Osaka to atone." And you see in her diary, she has actually quite a number of postcards of sumo wrestlers. Throughout her trip, Mrs. Gardner did not buy anything other than some tourist trinkets and commercially available postcards and photographs. It was only upon her father's death in 1891 that she decided to spend her inheritance on art, including Asian art. Although she did not have the financial resources of the Vanderbilts, Morgan, or Frick, Mrs. Gardner amassed an impressive collection which spans many cultures and periods and was largely completed between 1892 and 1901, which is quite staggering when you think what she has put together, and it was in such a short period of time. As with many other collectors, she enjoyed the advice and guidance of several key figures, among them the renowned Renaissance art historian Bernard Berenson, who played a central role in helping her shape her collection of Western painting. The other person was Okakura Kakuzo, a critic, art historian, and educator largely responsible for modernizing the visual arts in Japan. Okakura, who served as a teacher and mentor to Mrs. Gardner, was the author of The Ideals of the East, published in 1903, and the hugely popular Book of Tea, published in 1906. He also served as an interpreter and colleague of Ernest Fenolloso, a major influence on Charles Lang Freer. A comment in a letter to Berenson sums up Stewart Gardner's collecting philosophy, which I'm sure those of you who are collectors here will agree with her on this. "Do the best you can for me. Not many things, but the very best." Mrs. Gardner indeed devoted her energies to acquiring some of the finest Asian, American, and European works of art she could afford, and focused very much in juxtaposing them in meaningful ways to underscore their formal and conceptual relationships. For example, she was particularly interested in the link between Islamic and Italian art, as is evident in her purchase of the seated scribe here, attributed to Gentile Bellini. In order to highlight this relationship, she surrounded one of her most important paintings, Botticelli's Virgin and Child with an Angel, with Islamic objects. At other times, the groupings of objects were governed by her highly personal taste, such as the juxtaposition of a 6th century Eastern way stele and a 2nd century Roman torso of Dionysus. This idiosyncratic formal juxtaposition recalls a photograph of Charles Lang Freer, the founder of the Freer Gallery of Art, admiring Whistler's painting of Venus rising out of the sea and a Syrian jar. Throughout his life, Freer also searched for aesthetic harmonies or points of contact in American and Asian art, a principle that guided him in the formation of his remarkable collection, and also in many ways, I think, was the basis of his close relationship to Tryon. Charles Lang Freer was born in 1854 in Kingston, New York. When he was 14, his mother died, and as his father proved to be a poor provider for the family, he left school to work at a local cement factory. Later, when he was employed at the Kingston General Store, he attracted the attention of Frank J. Hecker, a manager of a local railroad, who hired Freer as a bookkeeper. In 1876, when Hecker moved to Indiana to supervise a new amalgamation of Midwestern railway lines, he brought Freer along. The two formed a lifelong friendship and, motivated by the rapid growth of the railway industry, moved together to Detroit in 1880. They became business partners in the Peninsular Car Company, and in 1899, thanks to Freer's business acumen, the company not only survived one of the worst depressions in the Gilded Age, but merged with several others to create the highly successful American Car and Foundry Company. Freer retired from active business at the age of 42 to devote himself to collecting, a life of what he called active leisure. Freer began as a collector of European and American prints in 1883, and actually many of the European prints were eventually given to Smith College. And it was in 1883 that he bought his first Asian work of Asian art, which is a modest folding fan spuriously attributed to Ogata Korin. Very soon thereafter, he acquired a second object, a bottle by Kano Tangen. And it was because of the delicate drawing that you sort of see on the bottle, reminded him of Whistler, who has been sort of Freer's main preoccupation until then in terms of his collecting interests. And Whistler also had a profound impact on Freer as a collector, because it was Whistler who told Freer at one point that Japanese prints and Chinese porcelain available in London and Paris were, I quote, the last gasp of a tradition. He asked Freer to promise that he would search the East for those little-known treasures that represent, again I quote, far earlier and higher culture. In that same year, in 1893, Freer embarked on his first trip to Asia, which profoundly changed him as a collector. With the Depression of 1893 and his efforts to minimize the financial burden on his railway car business, Freer was mentally and physically exhausted and intended, as he says, to free myself from work for a year and seek rest and pleasure in the old world. He crossed the Atlantic, lingering for a month in Italy and France before sailing to Ceylon, Sri Lanka. And this is where he first set foot in Asia in December 13, 1893. On the same trip, he also visited India and then Japan, where he arrived just in time for the cherry blossoms. Writing in the journal, he maintains, India is entirely unlike Japan, and Indian life and adventures will, I think, leave more lasting and precious impressions on my mind. Curiously, he never returned to India, but made several other visits to Japan during his subsequent 4 trips to Asia. Freer's first trip to Asia did not result in significant purchases of artworks. He traveled more as a tourist and returned to Detroit with an idealized memory of Japan that markedly affected him as a collector. In a letter to Hecker, he maintains, in Japan, a highly idealized, elusive aesthetic interpretation, a mingling of innocence, magic, and reverence together with admirable contentment and gladdened existence, compels one to recognize a holiness in Buddha's teachings. In another letter, emulating the form of a Japanese scroll, once he was in Japan, it's interesting, all his letters begin to look like this. He extols the merits of Japanese mode of travel. Rickshaw traveling beats all other methods, he says. Think of a human horse who will haul you 1 mile or 50 per day, whom you never overdrive and seldom tire, with whom you can eat, drink, smoke, and live with pleasure. And here's a photograph of Freer with 2 of his rickshaw men. I don't know. I mean, they look pretty tired to me, but that's. During his second trip and his third trips to Asia in 1908 and 1909, Freer spent considerable time in the Near East and visited Egypt, Syria, and the Holy Lands, making a number of significant purchases, including the third oldest Greek parchment manuscript of the Gospels attributed to the late 14th and early 15th century. Although Freer was not quite convinced of their date and importance, he was apparently, and I quote, carried completely off my feet when he saw these. Similarly, when he visited China, he acquired a number of newly excavated Neolithic jades, which appealed to him for their boldly articulated forms and their subtle hues. Like the Gospels, he knew almost nothing about these jades. And interestingly, nobody else cared about Neolithic jades at the time that appeared on the market in China. But Freer went absolutely crazy and just kept buying them. And as a result, the Freer Gallery has the most important collection of ancient Chinese jades outside of China. But also worth noting here is that in the early 1900s, the market for Japanese goods had become increasingly tight. Prices were high, and the Japanese were becoming more reluctant to part with important examples of their cultural patrimony. Thus, Freer's turn to the arts of the Near East in China were practical as well as aesthetic. While in Egypt, Freer fulfilled his quest for understanding more about rakaware, a ceramic tradition associated with Syria. Writing to Hecker, he claims, "I have invested pretty heavily in this line of faience and consider it necessary to learn what I can." So here, throughout his career, he was not only a collector, but he also really was a teacher. And I think, again, this sort of brings us back to the idea of why he was so keen to support Asian art at Smith and elsewhere. These turquoise and green glazed vessels with gritty white bodies and thick alkaline glazes appealed to Freer because of their chromatic relationships to his extensive holdings of East Asian ceramics and American tonalist paintings. Interestingly, the shimmering surfaces of the rakawares were not intentional, but the result of oxidization and the deteriorization of the glaze. But Freer didn't care, and he acquired a huge number when he was in Egypt from a certain man called Ali al-Arabi, and he's this rather shifty-looking character who's sitting here. And Ali al-Arabi was also the person who had sold him the Gospels. Freer also enjoyed the art of bargaining that went hand in hand with many of his purchases. I quote, "Poker and all other games are as nothing," he writes to Hecker. "It's real living, real experience, and beats winning a big contract for cars quite out of sight. In dealing with these Eastern devils, one's imagination is really stirred." Freer's second tour of Asia in 1906-1907 ended in Japan, where he no longer traveled as an anonymous tourist, as his reputation as a major collector had preceded him. Ernest Fenolloso, one of the foremost specialists of East Asian art and a major influence on Freer, had written him letters of introduction. Freer had met Fenolloso in 1891 after he had been in Japan for some 12 years teaching philosophy at Tokyo University. Although Fenellosa's introduction opened the doors of major private collections for Freer, his idyllic memory of his trip in 1895 were temporarily disrupted by the harsh realities of life in the modern cities of Yokohama and Tokyo. Freer recalls an incident when a priest took him to a dilapidated temple with, where all the objects were for sale. Freer was so excited, he spent 2 full days looking at the objects, studying them, and after the second day, he offered to buy the entire collection. But at that very moment, he found out that the so-called priest was a dealer, and all the other priests that were running around were just his members of his families. So it was, the whole thing was a ruse. Freer laments to Hecker, I quote, "Japan is undergoing tremendous changes in the fierce race for wealth and power, and its traditions and authentic ideals are being trampled in a mire hideous beyond description." And in another letter, he mentions, "The changes going on in Japan are terrible. Everything is being Europeanized." Still, none of these experiences dampened his enthusiasm for Asia and Asian art. During his last 2 trips, again in 1909 and 1910, Freer spent a considerable period of time in China. And he was ecstatic. As he says, "I spend all my daylight hours in the Tartar city. And here the scenes surpass those of the bazaars of Cairo and Constantinople." Given his reputation as a collector, as soon as he inquired about early Chinese paintings, which Fenellosa had recommended he should be looking for, dealers flocked to his room every single day. And he hardly had any time, apparently, to go and sightsee, because everybody wanted to sell their paintings to Mr. Freer. But one of the great highlights of his last trip was a visit to the Longman Caves. Freer was determined to undertake this hazardous journey and persevered, even though after his photographer was stoned by bandits and the cook, for fear of a similar fate, slept with a kitchen knife under his pillow, and apparently his other companions didn't sleep at all. The result of this trip, however, was an extraordinary 65-page journal that Freer put together and describes the caves in great detail. And this is particularly important because at the time, in the early 20th century, very few people actually went to the Longman Caves because it was so dangerous to get there. As mentioned earlier, Freer developed his lifelong interest in Asia only after he had already enjoyed a reputation as a serious collector of contemporary European prints, and also American prints. In 1888, he was asked to chair the art committee of the newly formed Detroit Print Club. As part of his responsibility, Freer was to organize the first 3 exhibitions of American paintings. The task meant that he had to consider the painting's careful juxtaposition and placement, which became a lifelong preoccupation. In his diaries, when he gave his collection to the Freer, there are these minute descriptions how objects should be placed. I mean, he goes down to that, this painting should be to the left of such and such object, and this pot should be in front of that. I mean, he was absolutely obsessed with the way that objects relate to each other or should relate to each other. During his tenure as head of the art committee, Freer also met some of the leading artists of the period, and with whom he formed lifelong friendships. These included Charles Platt, the architect of the Freer Gallery, and of course the painter Dwight William Tryon. One of the first paintings that Freer acquired is this oil painting by Tryon. And in fact, this is the very first painting also that entered the Freer collection as it is today. It is Tryon's 1889, The Rising Moon, Autumn. Freer was so taken by the subtle tonalities of this painting that he just described them to all of his friends. And the reason that he was so taken by this painting, because it reminded him of Asian art. And he was, again, so mesmerized that he commissioned Elbridge Kingsley to create a wood engraving of the painting, an impression of which is in the collection here. It took Kingsley 15 attempts to capture the tonal atmospheric harmony. So he kept making these prints and showing them to Freer, and Freer kept saying, no, this is not working. So he kept going back and trying again. The same year, Freer bought a second painting from Tryon entitled The Sea, Sunset. He intended to hang the two as pendants in his new Detroit residence, a relatively modest stone and shingle structure on Ferry Avenue. In 1892, when plans for the interior of Freer's house were underway, Tryon offered to create additional painting. His proposal comprised a group of works representing the four seasons, two seascapes for the entrance hall, and dawn, a composition bathed in ethereal light for the mantel facing the front door. And these sketches are, as you can say, from Tryon to Freer, not only sort of describing the paintings, but exactly showing where they are where they're to go. Freer became so devoted to Tryon during the construction and decoration of his Detroit house that he wrote to his architect, Ira Wilson, and I quote, "I know it will do your soul good to appreciate Tryon. Poor Innes," referring to George Innes, the most celebrated landscape painter of the period, "he is sure to be forgotten, while Tryon will live forever." In reference to the painting of Winter, which Freer again asked Kingsley to reproduce as a wood engraving, and again, this wood engraving is here in the collection, Freer notes, "quiet foreground, interesting lighted middle ground, and poetic sky and distance were reminiscent of early Japanese art." Freer's fascination with Japanese art clearly also had an impact on Tryon. In a letter to Freer describing Springtime, a work intended to hang over the fireplace, he writes, "A curious and indefinable mingling of the real and the ideal, and in some ways it reminds me of some of the very old Japanese works in color and abstraction." The work also had a particular resonance for Freer, who referred to it as one of the most satisfactory landscapes yet produced by any artist. And below you see, here you see a drawing by Tryon saying exactly where it was supposed to go in Freer's residence. Freer and Tryon not only shared similar aesthetic principles fostered by points of contact and ideals of beauty found in both East and Western art, but they also believed in the diffusion of these principles. In a letter to Tryon, Freer remarked that he did not really consider himself knowledgeable in the arts, but, and I quote, "I do believe that one's appreciation of beauty in any form can be strengthened, deepened, and broadened by intelligent comparative study." When Tryon became the director of the fledgling art department at Smith College in 1886, his commitment to teaching his students the principle of aesthetics led to the first display of Asian art at Smith. Held in 1897, the exhibition was based entirely on Freer's recent acquisition. It included 26 Japanese paintings and 4 screen panels, including Carp by Kuroda Toko. Tryon, who was an avid fisherman, called the work Out of Sight. The exhibition was such a success that it was mounted in the following year at Williams College. 4 years later, Tryon approached Freer for a second loan exhibition. This time, the selection focused on 35 ukiyo-e paintings, because Freer thought that they would give the students, and I quote, keener pleasure and more direct knowledge of the aims and methods of the principal masters of the school, which was the first to break away from academic practices. Freer had a long history of loaning his collection to public institutions. In 1893, all his Detroit paintings were on view at the Chicago Art Fair. Although he acutely felt their absence, he was convinced of the pleasure that the works would give to, and I quote, larger number of intelligent art lovers attending the fair. Over the next several decades, Freer became increasingly involved in exhibition design and display, and oversaw a number of installations that were, in effect, a dry run for the ultimate presentation of his collection at the Freer Gallery in Washington. By 1904, he had already made plans to give his collection to the nation and support the construction of an appropriate building to house it. At the same time, he was also committed in supporting the study of Asian art, not only through temporary loan exhibitions, but also through gifts. Among the recipients were, of course, Tryon and also Smith College. And as was mentioned earlier, Smith received objects as well as paintings. And here you see two paintings that are on display in the museum. I was going to say downstairs, but no, it's across the greens. And these gifts were given between 1913 and 1917. Freer also donated objects to Oberlin College, Minneapolis Institute of Art, University Club Michigan, and Williams College, thus ensuring that the presence of Asian art in these institutions, as well as their future study. With hindsight, one can claim that Charles Lang Freer's vision of collecting was tremendously broad and admirably perceptive, which contributed significantly in laying the foundation for Asian art in America. Since the early decades of the 20th century, almost every major museum today can boast a collection of Asian art, and most colleges and universities offer at least courses on the subject. Public institutions and private collectors have expanded their notion of points of contact, both within Asian artistic tradition and beyond, while they're also asking some fundamental questions. What is to be collected, and by whom? And perhaps more importantly, whose Asia are we representing? The creation of the Asian galleries and a wonderful collection here at Smith offers an ideal opportunity not only to celebrate and build upon the work of Freer and Tryon and some of the very generous recent supporters, but also to engage actively in the debates that are shaping the 21st century definition of Asian art. It will be an exciting and rewarding endeavor to the next 100 years. Thank you. We can go and have a drink. Sorry, not everyone.
Hi.
Hello.
I haven't been to the Freer Gallery in quite some time, and I was just wondering, do you take into consideration any of Freer's journals for his personal home in displaying the pieces in the collection? So their placement and such?
Actually, that's a really interesting question. Well, first of all, you should come back to the Freer very soon. We actually have recently reinstalled the Peacock Room. And if you've been, to the Freer, usually the Peacock Room has or had Chinese blue and white, because that was the reason that the Peacock Room was originally created. It was for Leyland's collection of blue and white porcelain in London. Well, Freer, being quite a sort of, idiosyncratic collector, didn't like blue and white. In fact, most of the porcelain that, is in the Freer, and we have an incredible collection, really was sort of collected later on. So when the Peacock Room moved to Detroit, Freer used it to display his collection of Asian art, Chinese, Japanese, a lot of the Syrian ware. So it was sort of his appropriation of the Peacock Room and his sort of stamp on it. When the Peacock Room, as you know, came to Washington, it was displayed with blue and white porcelains. So about 3 years ago, it's now 4 years ago, our curator of American art, Lee Glazer, decided, well, let's see what it looks like with Freer's collection. And what Freer had done, he had photographed the Peacock Room in Detroit. And there were descriptions. Unfortunately, the descriptions weren't that detailed. But he would say, this section should have, Korean, this section should have Japanese, etc. So together with the notes and the photographs, we were able to recreate the Peacock Room, how it looked in Detroit during Freer's time. So this is sort of the most extensive attempt that we've made so far in sort of recreating or sort of juxtaposing objects the way that Freer wanted and did. And he really was a frustrated curator, because it was, everything went, was very carefully planned and juxtaposed. And he had an amazing eye. So that's sort of the biggest attempt to do that.
I was really intrigued by your last paragraph, and I would love you to reflect on what you think are the important questions that museums collecting Asian art are going to have to answer as they build their collections over the next several decades. I won't hold you to a whole century, just a few decades.
Well, I have to say, there are some faces here in the audience who really helped us with trying to define, especially contemporary Asian art at the Freer. Can I call out a name? Dick Danziger, who's been sort of a mentor to many of us. He really helped us a few years ago trying to define what we should collect in terms of contemporary Asian art and where we should go. And it's a tough question. And because there are so many factors now that we have to take into consideration. Actually, we also had a conversation today with Fan about this. How do you collect? Now it's just, not only they're artists in Asia, but they are Asian artists in America. And in fact, with Dick, we had this conversation. Do we also collect American artists who do Asian work, who have nothing to do with, or that, they have no Asian blood, but they do Asian-inspired works? Where do they fit in? So of course, I think we sort of cheated. We said we'll collect everything, but when we can. I'm being a little flippant here, but it's very difficult. Sorry, I'm not really answering your question, but I think we all need to make choices, and that is becoming more and more obvious. And the definition of Asia is changing so fast that I think even 5 years ago, when we started this process of what kind of Asian art should we collect, what kind of contemporary Asian art should we collect, it's already changed. I mean, I'm sure if we, if all the curators came together and discussed the issue today, it wouldn't be the same that we discussed 5 years ago. And I think in many ways we all, all of us who are interested in Asian art, whether traditional or contemporary, I think the more we talk with each other and really try and help each other, because I think there needs to be a lot of learning, and also with colleagues in Asia. I mean, that's the other burning issue. I mean, I know in my area, for instance, which is the Islamic world, there's a lot of criticism that we get here in the United States, is that you're not really representing the real, say, Arab artists. You're just representing the artists who come through the biennials and the fairs. I mean, in a way, biennials now sort of have the same role that fairs did in the late 19th century. So you should go to the source and find the artist there. I'm not answering your question, and it's not that I'm trying to get out of it, but it's really complicated. I just feel that at some point, you have to make choices and stick with it. And that's exactly what Freer did. I mean, Freer started with European prints, which many of them are now here at Smith, because he decided, he's going to do Whistler, and then very small number of American artists. He then, started collecting Chinese and Japanese. He started collecting Islamic objects, especially Syrian ceramics. Around 1915, he said, I'm not going to continue with that. I cannot do everything. I'm just going to focus on China and Japan. And I think in many ways, that may be a way for many of us, especially the smaller institutions. I mean, what the Met does is completely different, because they're sort of a huge encyclopedic museum, but the smaller ones, I think we need to make choices. Uh-oh.
Well, my question.
Oh, I'm sorry. One more.
My question was about the future of contemporary art in the Freer Sackler. I mean, you have been pioneers in showing many important contemporary Chinese artists, especially, and but I wondered in terms of your permanent collection.
Mm-hmm.
But really, you've just addressed that issue in the answer that you gave, and it is the dilemma of the contemporary world. How do you go about it, and how ethnic are contemporary Chinese, Japanese, Indian, Iranian? I mean, we're part of an international community now, and so it's much harder you have to rethink how you're going to approach all this. And it's not an easy task.
No.
But it's a noble one.
Absolutely, I think so. And I think, we all need to do it together. I mean, it's critical. And I think what you've done here at Smith is really wonderful, because I sort of feel it's the next generation that we need to, I think the burden will become, bigger and bigger, and it's really up to this generation and the next generation to really help us.
Could I ask you to talk a moment about your specialty? What has happened to Iranian art in the 14 years since you took us to Iran? What are the trends? What are the problems? To what extent has politics interfered? What should we be knowing about Persian art that perhaps politics has prevented us from knowing about?
Well, I think the good news is that Persian art, or, contemporary art, is thriving. And I think if you think at moments when there is a lot of political repression, actually somehow art perseveres. And in fact, a lot of times by having restrictions, actually it sort of really helps you. I mean, when you think, the reason when sort of contemporary Persian art really sort of came to the attention, Western attention, was through film. It was really cinema, and those films were created at the worst possible time of political repression, and so artists have fortunately found ways of sort of getting around the repressions and create their art. I mean, I think what is now really remarkable is for instance, with a sort of emphasis of sort of culture in the Gulf states, sort of an easy outlet for artists not only from Iran, but Syria, Libya. I mean, when you think Egypt, all the places right now that are going through such political turmoil, the artists actually can sort of have a showcase for their art in the Gulf states that are still relatively calm. And so that sort of has become an outlet for them. But again, what is remarkable is that the arts are doing really well. In fact, now they are Sotheby's, there's sales that are just on contemporary Middle Eastern art, which is a completely new phenomena. And, some of them are good, but some of them aren't. But the fact that there is so much available and there is a market for it is quite astonishing.
Could you speak to the public support of museum collections? I was under the impression that your institution was struggling in competition with the numbers of new museums being added by the Smithsonian. And public apparent, I'm under the impression, especially when I visit, that people are not visiting.
When were you there?
Recently.
I think it depends in many ways. I mean, usually, we are competing with 19 museums and the zoo, and but we do have an advantage. We're the first museum off the metro, and we have the best bathrooms, apparently, in Washington. Not being facetious, but I think it, in many ways, the attendance depends on what exhibitions. We have an exhibition right now that has attracted, like 3,000 or 4,000 people, in a week. I mean, every week since it's opened, we've had, for just that one exhibition, sometimes every week we have 4,000 or 5,000 people just coming to see this one exhibition. So, if you come to Washington now and to the Free Sackler, it's Cherry Blossom series, it's mobbed. It's absolutely mobbed. So I think it really depends on when you come. And of course, what exhibition is on view. And right now we have a wonderful Japanese exhibition that I urge you all to come. It's, like every museum, we have to actively fundraise. The Sackler doesn't have an endowment, so in fact, going back to contemporary art, we cannot, we don't have the funds to buy contemporary art, or any art actually, for the Sackler. That's somewhat of a issue. But I think in terms of visitorship, we are actually one of the most visited smaller museums of the Smithsonian. I mean, we can't compete with the Air and Space Museum. And we certainly get more reviews in, national and international newspapers. So in that respect, I think we're doing pretty well.